They said the cabin was haunted. They said no one who lived there ever stayed long. But when an elderly man bought a haunted cabin for just $100, he wasn't looking for ghosts. He was looking for peace. What he found instead was something no one in that town dared to talk about: a secret buried beneath stone, silence, and fear for over a decade. Stay with us, because what he uncovered inside that cabin will stay with you long after the story ends. And if stories like this speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button. People in Red Hollow, West Virginia, used to lower their voices whenever they spoke about the cabin on Briar Ridge. Some crossed themselves. Others simply shook their heads and said, "Let the dead keep what's theirs." That was the place Henry Whitmore bought for $100. Henry was 73 then. His hands trembled slightly when the air turned cold, and his knees complained every morning before the sun came up. He had outlived his wife, buried a son, and spent the last decade in a quiet apartment where the walls echoed louder than his thoughts. What he wanted wasn't adventure. It wasn't trouble. It was silence. Real silence, the kind that lets an old man hear his own breathing and remember who he used to be. At the county auction, no one sat near him. When the clerk read the listing, abandoned cabin, poor condition, rumored, haunting, a ripple of discomfort passed through the room. No bids, not one. Henry raised his hand anyway. At his feet lay Max, an aging black and gray mutt with cloudy eyes and the calm patience of a creature who had loved only one human his entire life. Max leaned against Henry's boot, steady and warm, as if reminding him, "You're not alone." The gavel fell. For $100, Henry Whitmore bought a place no one else dared to claim, and unknowingly stepped into a story that would give his final years a meaning he never expected. The road to Briar Ridge wasn't marked on most maps. It peeled off the highway like a forgotten thought, narrowing into a gravel path that groaned beneath Henry Whitmore's old pickup. Trees leaned in close on both sides, their bare branches scratching the sky like bony fingers. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had already begun to bleed into night. Henry shut off the engine and listened. No birds, no wind, just a deep, unsettling quiet to complete, like the world itself was holding its breath. The cabin sat in a small clearing, slumped under the weight of years and rumors. Its logs were dark with age. The porch sagged like tired shoulders, and the windows reflected nothing but the dying light. People called it haunted, but to Henry, it looked lonely, abandoned, forgotten, much like himself. Max jumped down from the truck slowly, stiff in the hips. He sniffed the air, tail low, ears twitching, not afraid, just alert. "Easy, boy," Henry murmured. "We're just visiting tonight." The front door wasn't locked. That alone made Henry pause. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash, damp wood, and something else: old paper, maybe memory. He stepped in, boots creaking on the floorboards, and the sound echoed far too loudly for such a small place. A single room, a rough table, 2 chairs, a rusted iron bed frame pushed against the wall. And at the far end, a stone fireplace, massive, solid, built by hands that believed in staying put. Henry set down his lantern and swept the room with its soft glow. That's when he saw it. On the table sat a mug. Not dusty, not overturned, just sitting there, like someone had set it down and meant to come right back. Beside it lay a small leather notebook, its pages yellowed but intact. Henry swallowed. People didn't leave things like that behind, not unless they thought they were coming back. Max let out a low sound, then not a bark, not a growl. something quieter, uneasy. The dog had moved toward the fireplace. Henry watched him carefully. Max had been with him for 12 years through hospital rooms, funerals, and long, silent nights when sleep wouldn't come. He knew every sound that dog made. This one carried weight. Max stood frozen, staring at the base of the hearth. His body was stiff, his breathing shallow. The fur along his spine lifted just slightly. "What is it?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Max didn't look at him. He took a single step closer to the fireplace and pawed gently at one of the stones. Henry felt a strange chill crawl up his arms. He told himself it was just nerves, an old man alone in a place with a bad reputation. That was all. He knelt beside Max and rested a hand on his back, feeling the dog's heart racing under his palm. "You've been wrong before," Henry said softly, more to himself than to the dog, "haven't you?" But Max had never been wrong about the important things. Henry decided to lock up and sleep in the truck that first night. The cabin could wait. He stepped back outside, snapped on the padlock he'd bought in town, and leaned against the porch post, staring into the trees as darkness settled in fully. That's when it hit him. The stories didn't line up. If the cabin was haunted, truly cursed, why did the door stand unlocked? Why were there obstacles on the road and fallen trees that looked less like accidents and more like warnings? And why did the locals refuse to even bid on it? As if fear had been carefully taught. Fear, Henry knew, was often useful to someone. Snow began to fall as he climbed into the truck, thick flakes drifting down in heavy silence. By morning, the world was white and sealed shut. A storm had rolled in overnight early, violent and unforgiving. Henry had no choice but to take shelter inside. He returned to the cabin, lit a small fire, and watched the flames lick at the stone hearth. Max paced, restless now, eyes never leaving that same spot at the base of the fireplace. Finally, Henry spoke the words that would change everything. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the fear pressing into his chest. "Show me." Max moved immediately. He pawed at a single stone flat, rectangular, smoother than the rest. Henry crouched down, fingers brushing the edge. The mortar was different. Not old, not crumbling, sealed. Henry sat back on his heels, heart pounding. At 73 years old, with aching joints and a lifetime behind him, Henry Whitmore understood something in that moment with startling clarity. This cabin was never haunted. It was protected. And whatever lay behind that stone was something powerful enough that no one, absolutely no one, had dared to open it. Henry Whitmore didn't move right away. He stayed there on his knees, lantern light trembling in his hand, staring at that single stone as if it might suddenly speak. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls, snow piling higher, sealing the world away inch by inch. Whatever waited beneath that hearth, there would be no leaving until the weather decided otherwise. Max sat beside him now, no longer pacing, calm, certain, like a sentry who had finally guided his soldier to the right place. "Well," Henry whispered, his voice rough with age and doubt, "you didn't bring me all this way for nothing." He fetched the old pry bar from the truck, rusted, heavy, familiar in his hands. The metal groaned softly as he slid it into the thin seam around the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then just barely, the stone shifted. Henry sucked in a breath. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it echoed in his bones. A low scrape, a surrender. The stone came free with a dull thud, revealing a dark, square opening beneath the hearth. Cold air rose from it, carrying the smell of earth and time. Henry held the lantern closer. It wasn't a grave. It was a hiding place. Carefully built, stone-lined, deliberate. Inside lay two things. The first was a small metal box, olive green, scarred with age, the kind Henry remembered from his younger days, when men trusted steel more than promises. The second was a stack of journals tied with fraying twine, leather covers worn smooth by hands that had turned their pages over and over again. Henry's knees gave out. He sat back hard on the floor. "Oh," he breathed. "Oh, Lord." Max rested his chin on Henry's leg, steady as ever. Henry lifted the journals first. They were heavier than they looked, not just with paper, but with intention. The first page bore a name written in careful ink. Samuel Reed, 2009. Henry frowned. The name meant nothing to him. Yet, he opened the first journal and began to read. At first, the words were gentle. Observations about the mountains, the silence, the comfort of isolation. Samuel Reed had come to Briar Ridge for the same reasons Henry had to disappear quietly, to listen to the land instead of the noise of the world. Then the tone changed. Dates grew closer together. Handwriting tightened. Reed wrote about water samples, about a mining company called Iron Vale Resources, about strange illnesses in nearby towns, livestock dying, streams that smelled wrong after heavy rain. He wrote about asking questions, and about what happened after. County inspectors, sudden fines, boundary disputes that hadn't existed before, threats disguised as paperwork. Pressure applied not with fists, but with forms and deadlines. "They want me gone." Reed had written, not loudly, quietly, like I was never here. Henry felt his throat tighten. He had lived long enough to recognize this kind of cruelty, the slow kind, the kind that wears a man down until the world thinks he simply gave up. He opened the metal box next. Inside were folders, lab reports, maps marked with red circles, small glass vials, each carefully labeled with dates and coordinates. Henry didn't need a science degree to understand the numbers. Poison. In the water, in the soil, in the veins of the land itself. Samuel Reed hadn't vanished. He had been buried by silence, fear, and people powerful enough to make truth disappear. Henry closed the box with shaking hands. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows like impatient knuckles. That was when Max growled. Low, steady, warning. Henry froze. "Someone there," he called out, hating how thin his voice sounded. No answer. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable, the grind of tires struggling through snow. Henry moved to the window, wiped a small circle clear with his sleeve. A dark SUV idled outside the cabin. No markings, no siren. Just presence. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, moving like he belonged there. He knocked once. Hard. Henry didn't open the door right away. At his age, fear felt different. Less sharp. More honest. "What do you want?" Henry asked. The man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Just checking on you," he said. "This place has a history. Thought I'd make sure you were settling in." His gaze slid past Henry's shoulder, lingering just a moment too long on the fireplace. Henry understood then. The haunting, the rumors, the fear. They weren't meant to keep ghosts out. They were meant to keep people like Henry from ever looking beneath the stone. "I'm fine," Henry said quietly, "and this is my home now." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Just remember, he said, turning back to his vehicle. "Some doors are better left closed." The SUV disappeared into the white. Henry bolted the door and leaned against it, heart hammering. Max pressed close, solid and warm. At 73 years old, Henry Whitmore realized something that made his eyes burn with unshed tears. He had not bought a haunted cabin. He had inherited a truth, and whether he liked it or not, the final chapter of his life was no longer about hiding from the past, but standing guard over it. That night, Henry Whitmore didn't sleep. He sat in the old wooden chair near the fireplace, the journals stacked neatly on the table, the metal box hidden once more beneath the stone. The fire burned low, its embers pulsing softly like a tired heart. Max lay at his feet, eyes half closed but alert, rising and falling with each quiet breath. Henry stared into the flames and felt something shift inside him. For most of his life, he had believed that age was a narrowing road that each year took something away. Strength, speed, relevance, the world, he'd thought, belonged to the young now. His role was to step aside quietly, not make waves, not ask questions. That belief died in that chair. Fear had followed him all his life in different forms. In his 20s, it had been loud and physical. In his later years, it had become quieter fear of being a burden, fear of dying unnoticed, fear that his life would end without meaning. But this fear was different. This fear had a face, and names, and fingerprints. Henry opened one of Samuel Reed's journals again, reading slower this time. He noticed the care in the handwriting, the discipline in the dates, the stubborn hope between the lines. Reed had known what was coming. He had known he might lose everything, and still, he documented the truth. Henry's eyes stung. "All these years," he murmured to the empty room. They counted on time, doing their work for them. Time to erase memory. Time to let fear rot courage. Time to make sure no one left alive would care enough to dig. Henry had been wrong about something else, too. He thought he'd come to Briar Ridge to die quietly. But the truth was simpler and far heavier. He had come because he was old enough not to be afraid of consequences. Outside, the storm eased into a whisper. Snow still fell, but softer now, gentler, as if the mountain itself had decided to listen. At dawn, Henry brewed coffee over the fire. He poured a small splash onto the earth outside the door before taking his first sip, a habit he'd picked up long ago, a way of acknowledging something greater than himself. Max stood beside him, watching the tree line. "You know," Henry said, rubbing the dog's graying ears, "they didn't expect me." Max wagged his tail once. The man in the SUV had expected fear, confusion, maybe even gratitude for the warning. What he hadn't expected was an old man with nothing left to lose. Henry spent the day reading, studying, understanding. He laid the maps out flat, tracing the red circles with his finger. Streams, wells, springs. Places families relied on without question. He imagined children drinking from those waters. He imagined Samuel Reed, alone in this cabin, realizing that telling the truth might cost him his life. By afternoon, the fear was gone. In its place was something steadier. Resolve. Henry packed carefully. He didn't take everything, only copies of the most important documents. He wrapped them in oilcloth and tucked them into an old canvas satchel that smelled faintly of mothballs and memories. Then he sat back down and laughed softly. "Would you look at that?" he said to Max, 73 years old, "and I finally figured out what I'm for." The world had always underestimated quiet people, especially old ones. Henry knew how to wait, how to listen, how to move without drawing attention. Those weren't weaknesses, they were skills honed over decades of surviving loss. As dusk approached, headlights appeared again on the distant road. Henry watched from the window as a black pickup slowed near the turnoff, hesitated, then continued on. They were watching. Good. Let them. That night, Henry made a decision that felt heavier than any he'd made since burying his wife. He would not run. He would not sell, and he would not stay silent. Instead, he wrote a letter longhand, careful and deliberate, to an old friend named Thomas Hale, a retired investigative reporter who still believed in inconvenient truths. Henry hadn't spoken to him in years, but some bonds didn't rust. He ended the letter with a single sentence. "If anything happens to me, the truth is buried beneath a stone hearth on Briar Ridge." Henry sealed the envelope and tucked it inside the satchel. Max rested his head on Henry's knee. "I know," Henry whispered. "I didn't ask for this either." The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney toward the dark sky. For the first time in many years, Henry Whitmore felt something close to peace, not because he was safe, but because he was finally standing where he was meant to stand. Sometimes purpose doesn't arrive with youth or strength. Sometimes it waits patiently for a man to grow old enough to be brave. Opportunity rarely announces itself with trumpets. Most times, it arrives quietly, like a knock. You almost don't answer because you're too tired, too wary, or too old to believe it's meant for you. For Henry Whitmore, it came on the third morning after the storm. The sky had cleared overnight, leaving the world scrubbed clean and painfully bright. Snow blanketed the hills in a way that felt almost holy, untouched and innocent, belying everything buried beneath. Henry stood on the porch, mug of coffee warming his hands, watching his breath rise and disappear. Max sat beside him, tail tucked neatly around his paws, eyes scanning the tree line. Then a sound cut through the silence. Not an engine this time. Footsteps. Slow, careful, human. Henry didn't move for the rifle. He didn't hide. He simply waited. A woman emerged from between the trees, hands visible, boots dusted with snow. She looked to be in her late 50s, bundled in a thick coat. Her hair pulled back tight like someone who had spent a lifetime kneading it out of the way. She stopped several yards from the porch. "Mr. Whitmore," she called. Her voice carried no threat, just caution. "My name is Eleanor Brooks. I live down the ridge." Henry studied her face. He had learned that faces told stories if you gave them time. Hers held exhaustion and resolve. "I was told not to come here." Eleanor continued, "But I've learned that when people tell you not to do something, it's usually because they're afraid of what you'll find." Henry felt a slow smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "You'd be surprised how many folks have said that lately," he replied. Eleanor glanced at Max, then back at Henry. "I knew Samuel Reed." The name landed like a weight on the porch boards. Henry stepped aside without a word. Inside. Eleanor warmed her hands by the fire while Henry poured her coffee. She spoke slowly, choosing her words like someone who had practiced them alone many times. "Sam wasn't reckless," she said. "He was careful, and that's what scared them." She told Henry about the meetings held behind closed doors, about neighbors who suddenly sold their land and moved away, about wells that went dry and children who got sick while officials insisted nothing was wrong. "I tried to speak up," Eleanor said quietly, "but I had a husband with a bad heart, a mortgage. Fear does what it's designed to do. It keeps you breathing, but it kills your courage." Henry nodded, he understood that better than most. Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed with age. Sam gave me this before he disappeared. Told me to hold on to it until someone came along who wasn't afraid of losing what little they had left. Henry took the envelope with hands that felt suddenly very old. Inside were photographs, a ledger, names that matched the ones in Samuel's journals. "I think," Eleanor said, meeting Henry's eyes, that someone finally did come along. The fire popped softly, sending sparks upward. In that moment, Henry understood what opportunity truly meant. It wasn't escape. It wasn't money. It was connection. They weren't alone anymore. Over the next days, Eleanor returned, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with information. She told Henry who could be trusted and who absolutely could not. She warned him about Ironvale's reach, about how quickly men in clean coats could make trouble disappear. Henry listened carefully. He sent word to Thomas Hale using a circuitous route. Eleanor suggested no phones, no direct mail, just patience and layers. At night, Henry sat by the fire, Max at his feet, and imagined Samuel Reed doing the same thing years ago, hoping, perhaps praying, that someone would finish what he started. The danger hadn't vanished. If anything, it was closer now. But something else had changed too. Fear no longer filled the cabin. Purpose did. Henry Whitmore had spent decades believing his best days were behind him, that the world moved on without people like him, but standing there, surrounded by truth, by allies he hadn't known he had, he realized something profound. Sometimes opportunity waits until a man is old enough to recognize it, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. And Henry was finally ready to carry it. There is a quiet kind of strength that only comes with age. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to prove anything. Henry Whitmore discovered it one cold morning while splitting firewood behind the cabin, his breath fogging the air, his joints aching in protest. Each swing of the axe was measured. No wasted motion, no anger, just intention. Max sat nearby, watching, not guarding anymore, but trusting. Henry paused, resting his hands on the axe handle, and realized something that made his chest tighten. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for the day to end. He was planning for tomorrow. In his younger years, Henry had believed strength lived in muscles and speed. Later, he thought it lived in endurance, just surviving loss after loss without breaking. But now he understood true strength was knowing why you stood your ground when walking away would be easier. Every day, Henry grew more deliberate. He memorized the land, learned how sound traveled through the trees, which footsteps belonged to deer, which to men pretending they weren't there. He stopped leaving lights on at night, stopped moving on predictable routines. Not because he was afraid, because he was awake. Eleanor visited often, but never on a schedule. Sometimes she brought bread, sometimes news, sometimes nothing but silence and a shared look that said, "We both know what this costs." Henry began organizing Samuel Reed's work not like an old man preserving memories, but like a guardian preparing a handoff. He labeled documents, made duplicates, hid them in separate places. He spoke aloud as he worked, explaining his choices as if Reed were sitting across the table. "You were right," Henry said one night, fire crackling low. They thought time would do their dirty work for them. Max lifted his head at the sound of Henry's voice, tail thumping once. Henry smiled sadly. Turns out time had other plans. The man who once avoided conflict now anticipated it. When a county truck slowed near the ridge and turned around without stopping, Henry noticed when strangers began fishing downstream where no one ever fished. Henry noticed when Eleanor warned him that Iron Vale representatives were asking questions in town. Henry didn't panic. He prepared, and in preparing, something inside him healed. The loneliness that had once pressed on his chest like a weight began to loosen. Purpose has a way of doing that. It reminds a man that he is still useful, still needed. One evening, as snow melted into muddy streams along the path, Henry sat by the fire and spoke aloud to Max. "You know," he said softly, "people think getting old is about losing things. Strength, relevance, time." Max yawned, unimpressed. "But maybe," Henry continued, voice thickening, "it's about finally knowing what matters enough to risk what's left." He reached down and scratched the dog's graying muzzle. Max leaned into the touch with complete trust. Henry felt his eyes burn. He had survived his wife's last breath, his son's funeral, years of silence where no one said his name out loud. And somehow, those losses had prepared him for this, not by hardening him, but by stripping away fear. A man who has already buried his heart has very little left to threaten. One night, Eleanor stayed late. The fire had burned down to embers, and the wind hummed low outside. "They're getting nervous," she said quietly. "That usually means they'll make mistakes." Henry nodded. "Good. Mistakes leave fingerprints." She studied him for a long moment. "You're different from when I first saw you." Henry smiled faintly. "I was waiting to disappear. And now, he said, staring into the fire, "I'm waiting to be useful." The next morning, Henry did something that surprised even himself. He wrote a will. Not because he expected to die, but because he wanted to be ready. He listed the cabin, the land, the evidence, clear instructions, clear intent, nothing left ambiguous. Then he folded the paper carefully and placed it in the satchel beside Samuel Reed's journals. Max watched the entire time, silent and steady. Henry placed his hand on the dog's head. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "you did your job." Max's tail wagged once. In that moment, Henry Whitmore was no longer an old man hiding from the world. He was a witness, a steward, a bridge between a truth buried long ago and a future that deserved to know it. And that more than youth, more than strength, was what made him dangerous. The night it all came to an end. The mountain went unnaturally quiet. No wind, no owls, no movement, but the fire breathing softly in the hearth. Henry Whitmore noticed it because silence, true silence, had become something he listened to now. He sat in his chair, hands folded around a warm mug. Max curled at his feet but not sleeping. The dog's ears were forward, his body tense, and that way Henry had learned to trust without question. "Yeah," Henry murmured, "I feel it too." The headlights appeared just after midnight. Not one vehicle. 3. They didn't bother hiding this time. Engines idled at the edge of the clearing, their low rumble vibrating through the snow-packed ground. Doors opened, boots crunched. Voices murmured with practiced confidence, the kind that came from men who believed consequences were for other people. Henry didn't reach for the rifle right away. He stood. His knees protested. His back tightened. But he rose anyway, tall in his own quiet way. He slipped on his coat, kissed 2 fingers, and pressed them briefly to the photograph of his wife tucked inside the pocket. Max stood with him, shoulder to leg. Together, they walked to the door. The knock came before Henry could open it. Firm, expectant. When he pulled the door back, cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of gasoline and arrogance. A man stepped forward, silver-haired, well-fed, expensive coat. His eyes flicked past Henry into the cabin, searching. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said smoothly. "I'm Caleb Rowe, Ironvale Resources. We need to talk." Henry studied him for a long moment. "No," he said gently. "You need to listen." Rowe smiled thinly. "You're an old man living alone in a dangerous place. This doesn't have to be hard." Henry chuckled softly. "Son, I buried my child. You don't get to threaten me with hard." The smile vanished. Behind Rowe, one of the men shifted too close to the fuel cans stacked near the porch. Henry saw it. So did Max. The dog stepped forward, low growl rolling out of his chest like distant thunder. Rowe sighed. Last chance. Henry nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that." The first bottle flew through the window. Glass shattered. Flames bloomed instantly, hungry and fast, racing along the dry wood like they'd been waiting years for permission. Smoke filled the cabin. Heat followed. Henry didn't panic. He'd already said his goodbyes. He reached beneath the hearthstone one last time, not for the evidence, but for the truth of the moment. He looked at Max, eyes stinging, heart full. "Go!" Henry shouted over the roar. "Now!" But Max didn't move. He planted himself in front of Henry, teeth bared, body a living shield. Henry felt tears cut through the smoke. "Stubborn old fool," he whispered, though he wasn't sure which of them he meant. Outside, voices shouted. Fire climbed the walls. The roof groaned. Then, cutting through the chaos like a miracle that arrived exactly on time, came another sound. Helicopter blades. Powerful, relentless. A spotlight tore through the smoke, white and blinding. "Federal agents!" a voice thundered from the sky. "Drop your weapons!" Everything froze. Rowe turned, disbelief twisting his face into something small and terrified. His men dropped the bottles, hands went up. Henry staggered forward as agents poured into the clearing. Weapons raised, movements sharp and controlled. Someone grabbed his arm. Another wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Henry barely noticed. He was looking at Max. The dog stood unharmed. Smoke darkened fur, rising and falling with steady breath. When Henry dropped to his knees, Max pressed his forehead to Henry's chest, grounding him. The cabin collapsed behind them with a roar of sparks and flame. Henry watched it burn not with grief, but with release. Dawn broke pale and quiet over the wreckage. The fire died. The truth didn't. Ironvale's men were led away in cuffs. Warrants were read. Names spoken aloud that had only ever lived in whispers. An agent approached Henry, a voice respectful. "Sir, the evidence. It's intact." Henry nodded, exhaustion finally settling into his bones. "It always was," he said. Someone just needed to be old enough to wait for it. As the sun crept over Briar Ridge, Henry sat on the back of an ambulance, Max's head in his lap, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not because he had won, but because he had stood. Because when the fire came meant to erase truth, it had instead illuminated it. And in the quiet aftermath, Henry Whitmore understood the final gift of a long life. Not comfort, not safety, but the courage to say, "This ends with me." In the end, Henry Whitmore didn't keep the cabin. It burned to the ground, reduced to ash and memory. But what surprised him most, what still surprised him even weeks later, was that losing it didn't feel like loss at all. Because Henry had finally learned something most people never do. Life is not measured by how long we hide from pain, but by the moment we decide that truth matters more than comfort. that there comes a time when silence costs more than speaking, and safety costs more than courage. Henry had lived long enough to understand that fear never really leaves us. It just changes its shape. When we're young, we fear dying. When we're old, we fear being forgotten. And yet, the bravest thing an aging heart can do is this: stand anyway. Not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. Henry stood because someone had to finish the story of a man who disappeared, because children deserved clean water, because the years he had left, however few, still belonged to something bigger than himself. In the quiet after the fire, Henry realized the truth. A life doesn't need to be long to be meaningful. It needs to be honest. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.